Welcome back for another episode of Forage Focus. I'm your host, Christine Gelley, and on today's show, we are going to be discussing bloat, why bloat might be a concern, and what factors we can control to reduce our risks. Steve Boyles will be my special guest today as we dive into this topic. Stay tuned. The grazing season is now in full swing here in Ohio, and throughout the state, we have observations of things that are occurring, everything from weeds popping up along roadsides and in pastures to issues with animals grazing. Today's issue that we're going to discuss is bloat. And with me is Dr. Steve Boyles, our OSU Extension Beef Specialist, to talk more about bloat and the concerns associated. Dr. Boyles, please introduce yourself.
Glad to, Christine, and a pleasure to be here. I'm Steve Boyles, and I'm the OSU Extension Beef Cattle Specialist. And, with regards to bloat, Christine, we've been talking about it a long time. There are journal articles from the 18th and 19th century with discussions of bloat. Some people may know it as tympany or blown or some other older name, but we'll stick with bloat today.
And Steve, what is bloat? For someone who may be new to this whole grazing concept, when we talk about bloat, what are we actually referring to in the condition of the animal?
Sure. One of the things, if say you go out in the morning, a lot of times bloat will maybe occur in grazing cattle in the morning, not to say that's the only time. You go out there and look at the left side of that animal and it's distended. That's where the rumen is located. And that's because there is gas buildup. The animal is not able to eliminate that gas. Normally that's going to escape through the esophagus, and they just can't keep up with the gas production that's happening. I'm not suggesting if you see a rumen distended that you need to be immediately in an emergency situations. But a lot of times you're going to see that after they've had significant consumption of feed. So from the outside, that's what it looks like. From the inside, that is gas buildup that the animal is having trouble eliminating. Once again, they're not like us passing gas. They rely more on their front end, the esophagus, to move that gas out, and they're having trouble doing that. And it's hard on them in that an animal that's in a severe situation of bloat and they die, it's due to suffocation. There is so much gas buildup that causing a problem for them to bring anything else in, like oxygen.
Now, all the time, right, in the rumen, there is a production of gases, and that back and forth exchange, release of gas is constantly occurring in ruminant animals. But when we have a bloat situation, the rate of gas production and release is not matched. So we have overproduction of gas with not enough release of the gases, and they're building up inside that rumen. And that's why we're seeing the bloat on the left side of the animal. Steve, to my understanding, the symptomology of bloat can tell us whether we're in mild discomfort for the animal all the way up to a really severe case of bloat. How do we tell the difference between slight bloat and, wow, this is really a problem for the animal, we need to seek help?
Yeah. After they've eaten, say in the morning or in the evening, you may detect a little bit of distension of the rumen. I may want to walk around again and check on that animal or animals to make sure it's gone back down. If the animal has extension on both sides, I don't know, I'm tempted to go to the barn or start moving that animal, certainly to the handling facility, and we may do something there. When we get to what I call external behavior, if they're standing with their feet out, head down, they're drooling, and they're gasping for air, we're in a severe situation. and we may have to do some more dire type of activity than in an intermediate situation. We'll get to tubing cattle, that sort of thing.
Right. And so we've already discussed, why is this a concern? Well, it's a concern because in a severe case, this could lead to death for the animal. And if not death, definitely severe discomfort, reduced intake. And so we have multiple reasons why the cattle may overconsume and other animals as well, not just cattle, but sheep, goats, horses can be prone to bloat as well. But there's multiple environmental factors occurring that may lead to the overconsumption of lush forages. There may even be issues with the animal itself that make it predispositioned to have issues with bloat. What are some of those environmental factors that increase our risks of having bloat?
Anytime the grazing behavior is interrupted for a significant amount of time, that can have an impact. Let's say we have a big storm come through and they don't eat. Well, when they are able to eat, then they're probably going to overconsume. Also, the type of forages that we have out there on the pasture, we really do promote legumes, and they are an excellent forage source. But to everything, there is a limit to how much perhaps we need in our pastures. When we start approaching rule of thumb, 50% legume, we're probably getting into over a little more legume than the animals deserve, but also we're increasing the chances of bloat situations with that much legume. Can it happen at less levels? Absolutely, but that's why we need to keep an eye on that situation. With cattle, we can get into bloat, like you said, horses too. For me, I'm getting off on topic. I know I've got too much legume in a horse pasture when they start to slobber. So I wouldn't want to go out there with white pants on. But still, legumes like red clover, white clover, alfalfa, in significant portions. And that's where we get into that, what we're kind of leading into is that frothy bloat. They create bubbles inside the rumen, and that is gas that's trapped. It's not going to leave the animal.
Steve, you used the term frothy bloat. There's different kinds of bloat, and in the situation we're talking about today, we're talking about frothy bloat, and that occurs from animals grazing. But you can also have bloat occur in a feedlot situation. How is that different from frothy bloat?
Yeah, and I'm this is what I do. I call it the same thing. I call pasture bloat and feedlot bloat, and we more commonly associate frothy bloat, the gas bubbles, with legumes that cause those bubbles. Now, in feedlot bloat, if we use that term, that means there's gas buildup, but there's really not bubbles. There's just pressure on the rumen, and we can maybe pull that off with just releasing the gas. Now, in a frothy bloat situation, we're probably going to have to add a defoamer to reduce the bloat. But I don't want to say we never have quote unquote gas or bubbles always on pasture or non-bubbles on feedlot. But that is how I call it. But for the audience out there, there's frothy bloat, and then there's a bloat that's you don't have bubbles. But yeah, they're more common, the bubbles on pasture, no gas in a feedlot.
I think in either case, it's common that we see more issues with bloat and other types of digestive upset anytime that we're switching our rations. When we change the composition of the diet, that changes the rumen microbes, and we're going to have a different response in the digestive tract as a result of those changes. And so whether you're managing animals in a feedlot situation or pasture or a mixture of the two, bloat could occur in either case, and it's important to keep an eye on the animals and watch for symptoms that may indicate bloat. We across the state, as of right now, have been hearing some issues with bloat, and those seem to be attributed to a high concentration of legume in lush pasture situations. Now, knowing that that could be a more risky situation, what can managers do ahead of time, anticipating that bloat may occur? How can they set themselves up for success where risk of bloat is reduced.
Okay. Well, one of the things, we already talked about the amount of legume. You're kind of stuck with what you've got when you're going to let them out. But you brought it up. There's a change in diet. These animals may have been eating hay or have been in a lot situation. And then you're going to put them out on grass. As you pointed out, that's a change in the diet. So one of the things, let's put some hay into those animals before they go out on the pasture so they're not hungry. And that's probably even, that's not just the day before. We're probably going to make sure they're acclim or getting full maybe a few days ahead of time. And we've had all that pasture. It's highly digestible out there, so that's a change. Then think about we're going to talk about some products here. If you look out there and say there's 50 whatever percent legume, in that situation, I'm not going to rely on luck. I'm probably going to go to the local feed store, and they do sell these blocks that have the typical name paloxylene, but bloat guard is a trade name in those blocks. And I would probably make them available before, at least 3 days before they go out to pasture. So they start getting the product, but much as anything, they start recognizing what it is. It's a block that has molasses in it. It's not a mineral block, but they'll get used to consuming it when we move them out to the pasture.
And so what I'm hearing you say is that each time we have a switch like this, we need to slow the transition if we can. So we're not going straight from a solely dry hay diet to just lush green pasture. We want to make that an easier transition for the animals by providing both, and then also supplying anti-bloat measures if we can. Something I think may be a factor too in these situations we've seen recently is animal behavior prior to a weather change. You mentioned that if animals don't get a chance to eat before a storm, they could overconsume at the next grazing period. I believe the same is true ahead of a storm. Animals have a tendency to prepare for an extreme weather event by eating more than what they typically would in case they don't get the chance to go out and graze again for a little while. So do you agree? Could that be a factor as well in overconsumption?
Absolutely. I think I think there's data out there supporting what you just said, Christine, that they respond to barometric pressure. They feel the storm coming in. In feedlots, we talk about storm diets. That means I may go back to a diet that's higher in forage if I know a storm's coming in. Like you pointed out, there may hit the bunk hard. It's harder to do in a pasture situation, but admittedly, that same behavior happens with animals in a pasture situation. So definitely keep in mind, look out for bloat before or after storm, because that is a change to the rumen environment.
In regard to the composition of the forage and the physiology of these plants growing, we can also have an overgrowth or overabundance of lush forages if we've applied fertilizer recently or we've applied too much on our last application. It's important to remember that these forages are going to be responsive to fertilizer and have a flush of growth afterwards. And so sometimes if the weather is nice, producers can get the urge to go apply fertilizer earlier than what may be advisable. And applying fertilizer in early spring is going to contribute even more to the lush growth that occurs. We can have issues related to multiple things, including grass tetany, but also to bloat if we have an over-fertilized stand of forages. And so it's important when we're timing our management activities that we're fertilizing at the right time that makes sense for the forages and taking into consideration how the nutrients are taken up by the plants and then distributed in the animal during grazing. And so monitoring our stocking density as well is important. Having smaller paddocks for animals to graze gives us more control as managers in how much forage they can actually consume in a given period of time. We may have the ability to add more animals to consume a larger paddock or to make our paddock sizes smaller to be more appropriate for fewer numbers of animals per acre. those conditions in the pasture change from day to day, depending on the weather. And so being an observant pasture manager is one of those key components of bloat prevention. We may have some animals too in the pasture that seem to have issues with chronic bloat. Steve, what makes them have chronic bloat and what do we do with those problem animals?
Yeah, chronic bloaters, it's genetic. Where did they get it from? Probably back there somewhere. Chronic bloater is the one that just, you're always having to tube it to take care of the gas. And really, Christine, to put it in layman's terms, they're not producing enough spit. Saliva is an outstanding product for lubricating the esophagus, for digestive tract, and it's a defoamer also. And these animals don't produce enough of this saliva to get in the rumen to break up those bubbles. We have the same problem in the feedlot situation. Saliva is an excellent buffer. Feedlot diets can drive down the pH in the rumen, and there's not enough saliva for the buffer. Those are animals we're going to wrestle with the entire feeding period, and you might consider just selling those animals.
Certainly not ones you want to keep around in the breeding herd, where they may pass those traits on to the other offspring that follow. Anytime that we can make our jobs easier as livestock managers, that equals profit over time. We have to remember how valuable our labor is in the system as well. Okay, so we've talked about preventative measures. Now, if we have bloat occur anyway, or we didn't know about those preventative measures ahead of time, what are our steps when it comes time to treat bloat?
We'll talk about more severe treatment, but let's say somebody, they've put the animals out there and they've started to notice bloat. My first salvo is to get those bloat guard blocks out in the pasture. And you need about one bloat guard block for about every 10 animals. And the difference between a bloat guard block or mineral, now Christine and others have recently had a number of educational programs on grazing. And we talk about mineral as a grazing distribution tool. So you take it away from the water. A bloat guard block, you want it right real close to the water because you want them to consume it. Now you can put it in feed too if somebody's providing a supplement. So that's my first salvo. I think I have problems. That may be the lowest labor you were talking about. But treatment, okay, we've got a bloat situation out in that animal. Let's move that animal into the corral handling facility, and we're going to tube that animal. We're going to put a hose down into the esophagus, into the rumen. Couple things here. This isn't just a regular garden hose and you cut the edge off of it. You think about how that might cut on the esophagus of the animal. So it needs to be a soft type of hose that you're going to put down through there. It's a fine line between being too floppy and being too hard, but a regular garden hose, at least you're going to have to find something to put on the end of it so it's not sharp. And the animal may want to chew on that. Ideally, we have what's called a tow car or a metal tube. It doesn't have to be a fancy thing. It could be, just a piece of metal that's bigger diameter than the hose. And you slide the hose down through there and you put that in the rumen. How do you know if you're in the rumen? Well, you might hear a gurgling sound. That's one thing. If you have, we talked about feed bloat. If you put it in there and gas starts coming off, you know you're in the rumen. If you put that hose in and you hear breathing, you're in the lungs. And I speak from personal experience. I was trying to drench a bull and I put the drench into the lungs. That's not good. That's fluid in the lungs. So pull it back out and then work till you hear, say that, the smell of rumen fluid, methane, whatever you like, but make sure you're in that rumen. Then once again, you can let the gas off. I might hasten to add at this moment, don't be smoking when you do this. Methane is an explosive. So don't do this for fun or you'll burn down your barn. But get it in there. Then we've got frothy bloat. We're going to focus on that. We may need to put something in there that's going to break up those bubbles. Now, we come back to the trade name paloxylene. That's what it's going to be. The name on the shelf at the store is probably TheraBloat, same thing as the bloat guard, but just a different name. You can put that down in there, and that's going to start breaking up the bubbles. If I don't have that, we can use mineral oil. Pour that down through that hose, and that'll start breaking up bubbles. If I don't have mineral oil, go to the house and get some laundry detergent. Now, you might have to mix it with a little bit of water. Of course, now that we have the liquid detergent now, pour some of that in there, because laundry detergent, I'm not necessarily recommending it above some of these other products, but we've got to break up those gas. And you probably have to move that hose around while you're doing it. If you put it down too far in, it's in fluid in the room, and you got to pull it up till it's just above the fluid in the room and where all the gas is, and you start letting that off. So you may have to move around with that hose to find out where you're at and start feeling the gas coming off that animal.
As far as animal handling in the moment goes, how would we want to position the animal for us to administer the tube? I have read and heard that we do not want that animal to lie down. We want the animal to be standing the entire time. Is that correct?
Yeah, that would be ideal. Don't have a lot of time to go into anatomy, but they even suggest, or I suggest others, to maybe have them with their front feet higher. That puts the fluid away from the esophageal opening where in the neck. And so we've prevented that, so there's more air around the esophagus. And if we've broken up those bubbles, then they're going to more easily go out. So if you could put in a little block after you've put them into a head gate. Years ago, I've done something with a rope halter. I don't recommend that with people. Well, without a head gate, it's really hard to do. But anyway, yeah, you could have the front feet elevated, leave a block out there next to the head chute so that you throw that in there if you're going to treat a bloat situation.
Now, in the unfortunate event that bloat has occurred, say, overnight, we didn't see the symptomology, we weren't able to help the animal, and we found dead animals in the pasture, how can we observe the situation to attribute that this was caused by bloat versus some other factor?
Well, I'm going to start relying on my veterinarian to do some toxicology there. I often, as a nutritionist, if it's happening to a lot of animals, then I look at, say, nutrition related. And if I've got 2 or 3, that could be bloat when we open that animal up and you could see the bubbles in there. Admittedly, dead animals can be have built up gas because the animal is not breathing. The other thing, in a worst case scenario, we're not done yet treating an animal. If the animal's breathing, it's laying on its side, I may not be running to the farm to get my hose. I may have to pull out my pocket knife. And we're going to open up the side of the animal, that rumen on the left side, to release gas. It's my last ditch activity to do that. But if the animal's breathing, they're on their side, that's my last option, I think.
What would we do for care afterwards to try to make sure that that wound heals appropriately after the release of the gas?
Yeah. You may have to call the veterinarian after you've done this. If the animal's laying on its side, extended rumen, still breathing, but it's labored breathing, you may not go ahead and call the veterinarian. But I'm not sure you're in a situation that you can wait. So the fancy name for a knife for this specific purpose, or it's actually a sharp pipe. You shove it in there, and it's called a tocar, and it has an opening, and then you're going to release gas off. They do make one now that's a screw-in made out of plastic. I'm not suggesting everybody has to have these new tow cars. Sure, not a bad idea. But if I was a stocker operator, young calves, letting them out on spring pasture, I might check with my veterinarian and go ahead and purchase a metal tow car or some of the plastic one that you screw in. Well, and I'm finally getting back to Christine, what you asked for post after the tow car. The veterinarian is going to have to sew this up. The things to be concerned about for the animal is peritonitis. Here's the skin and here's the rumen, and we've cut through both. And see this area in between? Rumen fluids is going to get in there. That's still in the body. That's an infection or peritonitis. So we need to sew up one of them. We need to sew up the other. So there's two different stitches going on here in this situation. The advantage of one of those screw-in type of tow cars is you don't get as much separation while the gas is coming off. So there's maybe less sewing that's going on, but still, unless somebody's really, and I won't claim I am good at sewing things up, there's two stitches, one on the rumen and then another on the skin.
Before we really take action on what we're going to do for an animal that's experiencing bloat, I would say, first off, try to give your vet a call and see, what do you suggest I do? Do you happen to be in the area where you could come and help me? And we realize that many parts of rural Ohio may have an extended wait time for your veterinarian to arrive. You may not have enough time to wait for the vet. But if all goes well and you are able to release the gas from this animal, you likely want to do a follow-up with your veterinarian. Even if everything seemed to go well on your first attempt, there could be some additional damage to the esophagus as a result. And likely, if the bloat was severe, you could see issues with performance for that animal into future years. So it may wind up on the call list, even if you were successful in your protocol. In situations where we have seen livestock struggle from bloat or poisonous weeds, how prevalent of an issue is this, and what animals do we need to be most concerned for?
Sure. I'm going to initially say my prime suspects are going to be some of the younger animals. They're growing. They eat a higher percentage of their body weight because of that. So a stocker operator might be a natural that's putting those animals out on this fresh green pasture that you've talked about. So with that in mind, and we've just talked about treatment, prevention, and some of the tools, sitting down with your veterinarian would be a good plan at some point, not just right now, but prior to that, and say, well, I need a hose, and that they may have a recommendation on the hose, or maybe they've got something that they could tell you where to buy, the perfect hose that's, not too stiff, or that sort of thing. And also a speculum, or, they may show you, hey, you've got an iron pipe that's, this long, that'll work, and have the TheraBloat that you can purchase and just have that ready to go. Then also, if you suspect, have some bloat guard. Maybe you're going to put it in feed because you're going to supplement the steers, or it's in blocks. It's just be ready to go, and just assume that this might happen.
There are so many environmental factors that play into how we manage our grazing systems. So it's always best to be prepared for the worst and hope for the best. We hope the best for you as we continue into our grazing and forage harvest seasons. As always, feel free to reach out if you have additional questions or comments from today's episode. Our contact information is located on the screen. You can email us or call us to discuss more. Steve, thank you so much for joining us today for Forage Focus. We look forward to having you again on the show sometime.
Absolutely. Thank you, Christine. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, and join us again for another episode of Forage Focus.